So we have a brand new interview with the developers of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth where they talk about the game's sales, a potential real-life version of Queen's Blood, an insane fan theory about Chadley being the final boss of the entire trilogy, and if the story will deviate from the original. So if any of that sounds cool to you and you like what you hear, you can like the video and subscribe if you'd love to stick around. It's always appreciated. So before we get into the news, I gotta say happy 17-year anniversary to Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII. Yes, feels like it's been shorter, but apparently it's been 17 years since that game's release. I played so much of it on my PSP. I loved it to death. Very divisive game back in the day, not the greatest control scheme in the first half of the story, not the best, but I will say if you're someone who missed out on the OG Crisis Core, you should check out Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion. It's a really well done remaster that has so many great quality of life fixes to it. It looks great, it's easily available everywhere, and I did a review for that game that I worked super hard on if you guys would like to check that out. But happy 17-year anniversary, Crisis Core. Zach, it's good to have you back in the Remake trilogy. So this interview comes to us from Anime News Network where they sat down with Yoshinori Kitase, Naoki Hamaguchi, and Teruki Endo to talk all things Rebirth. And this is really cool. The fact that we're still getting information from the developers on Rebirth is really nice. I thought for sure the game would come out in February. Maybe we'd have a couple of interviews and then they'd go radio silent to work on part 3. But they've been giving us steady drips of information on Rebirth, some behind the scenes stuff, and even info on Remake Part 3, which again, we know we're going to get more solid information on Part 3 around this time next year, which is super sick. I'll leave a link to the article in the description below as there's a few things that I do touch on, but I'm going to have to cut them out of the video because otherwise this video is just going to be way too long. So if you want to read it yourself, you can check out the description. And as always, there will be spoilers for Final Fantasy VII Remake, Rebirth, and the OG in this video if you'd like to avoid those. But they start off first with Teruki Endo, who is the game's combat lead, where they ask him were there any challenges they faced from taking the characters from Remake to Rebirth. Endo responds by saying, so firstly, one major difference is that the number of characters significantly increases within the two titles, so balance adjustments were necessary. With Rebirth, a new system was added, the synergy ability and the synergy skills in terms of battle. This had to be done considering the existing attributes of the characters and then readjusting based on those to create these abilities and skills. Now, I would assume that stuff is super difficult to figure out. And again, Teruki Endo was someone who came in during Remake's development about halfway through and came up with the idea for this combat system in 6 months. And granted, it's not just Teruki Endo. It's not just him programming everything. He came up with the concept. He is the combat lead, but there's a ton of people that work with him to create enemy designs and then implement those enemies into battle, as well as bosses and summons and work on the characters. And I imagine you couldn't just pluck the characters from Remake into Rebirth and have them work. There's so much that has to be taken into account when bringing those characters in, especially with their movesets and all of the different abilities they have. You might have something that worked just fine in Remake because it was mostly like a flat terrain linear game, but then you bring it into Rebirth and there's these grassy hills, canyons, all these uneven surfaces, and some moves might have some issues and need to be readjusted. So I imagine that must have been a nightmare having to deal with. And it might be the same thing taking the newer abilities and transferring them over to Remake Part 3, but if anyone can do it, these guys can, and I very much, again, appreciate the synergy skills and abilities. And those were things that I fully utilized throughout my entire playthrough. And what I did find kind of interesting is that watching other people play through the game, maybe people who weren't as familiar with Final Fantasy, they didn't really use these synergy skills all that much, which are free to use. They boost your ATB bar, and you can do them whenever, and there's some that are really, really good. But I didn't see too many people taking full advantage of those, which was unfortunate. Maybe on further playthroughs, they'll open their eyes to them. And then of course, incorporating the story stuff of these characters getting closer and bonding and learning so much more about each other, having that transfer over into the gameplay mechanics with all of the synergy stuff is just super cool. It makes the characters feel like real humans, it makes them feel like genuine friends, and seeing them together in battle just is the icing on the cake. Now up next, they talk to Kitase about the underperforming sales for Rebirth and if they have any plans to expand Remake into Rebirth onto other consoles. Kitase responds by saying, regarding the strategy of the console release, there's sort of nothing we can comment on regarding that, but overall we are looking forward to more players enjoying and playing this title, so we wish for that to happen. And this is kind of a bittersweet question because on the one hand, there's not much that the developers can say about this specific situation in terms of sales. They just make the game to the best of their ability, they put it out, it was incredibly well received by critics, garnering a 92 Metacritic score, which is really high, and I believe the highest rated Final Fantasy since Final Fantasy IX, although there's some factors that go into calculating that game score. But a lot of this stuff, whether it's sales or marketing or console exclusivity, is not up to them. It ends up coming down to Square Enix, the higher ups there, and whether or not they're willing to take these games and put them onto other systems. And right now, again, Sony and Square Enix are still dealing with that exclusivity agreement. Now, the windows are getting shorter for these games as they release, but I don't think you're going to see Remake, Rebirth, and Part 3 on an Xbox until they finish up the entire Remake trilogy. Remake Part 3 will most likely come out, have a shorter exclusivity window, and then afterwards, the PC version will hit, and most likely some sort of bundle on Xbox where you can either play it through Game Pass or buy all 3 games for one specific price. And last we checked, there were some industry insiders saying that Rebirth sold around 2 million copies in its first month, which again, I think is pretty good. It's not what Remake did, which was 3 million in 1 week, but that's to be expected. There's always going to be drop off with sequels, whether they're games or TV shows or movies. And I would have to speculate that by now the game has probably sold around 3 million units, maybe a little bit more, just because it's been out for a while and there are still new people discovering the game. Now, what is very interesting that I want to touch on very quickly is the marketing. I feel like there was pretty much a severe lack of marketing for Rebirth. I didn't really see this game much of anywhere unless I actually sought out the game myself. They had a very small live stream launch for the game where it was in studio, hosted by Kenny Omega and Naomi Kyle. They had some of the cast members show up and play the game and talk a little bit about it, but it was a very small event. And I compare that to the launch of Final Fantasy XVI. That game was everywhere. It had consistent trailer drops, info dumps. I think it was at almost every single Sony State of Play or showcase that they had. It got its own State of Play dedicated to the game, which Rebirth did as well. I saw commercials for 16 on TV. I'm a wrestling fan, so every Friday night when I would sit down to watch SmackDown, there was always 2 commercials for 16. One in the first hour of SmackDown and one at the top of the second hour of SmackDown. So they also had a massive launch event for 16. They had this big red carpet event in, I believe, LA, where they had tons of influencers and fans come out. They had panels on stage. People like Maximilian Dude was there interviewing the devs and playing the game. There was tons of kiosks promoting the game, and they had people streaming to Twitch from the event itself. So it really seems like Square put a ton of marketing into 16, and I think maybe they relied too heavily on the name recognition of Final Fantasy VII to promote Rebirth. So that's something that I hope they do fix with Part 3. You really got to push that marketing. You got to have brand deals coming out the wazoo. You got to have commercials on TV, ads online. Do what they did back in the day. Do a brand partnership with Coca-Cola, which is pretty sick. You could do like special limited edition bottles. One bottle maybe has Cloud, another's got Tifa, Sephiroth. That's something that Marvel has currently been doing with Coca-Cola, where they have different superheroes on bottles. But there are so many different partnerships that you can do. You can continue your partnership with Red Bull, do special edition Final Fantasy VII energy drinks. There's endless possibilities when it comes to marketing. But again, it's really going to depend on how much marketing budget they've put into Part 3 already, or if there's going to be more added later down the line. But the games are superb, and I really think more people just need to know about them. Now, up next, they talk about giving players more freedom and spontaneity for Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3. Endo responds by saying, while I'm unable to comment on granular details of that right at this moment, I believe that instead of the devs or the creator dictating how the player should play along a pre-planned path, so to speak, it's better to allow more freedom and the user's choice to be able to play in their own way that they wish to. Well, naturally, there are challenges to actually realizing that, and when you go into making that a reality, my thoughts are also that for the Final Fantasy series to continue to reinvent itself, to revitalize itself, and stay fresh to our players, this type of constant evolution is necessary in terms of the battle elements as well. So those are the underlying thoughts I had while making that comment. And this is a big one. I've also had people on my channel talk about this, but there are aspects of Rebirth, even though I enjoy it, where it can feel like you're just checking off a bunch of boxes on a list, looking at a map, The map is telling you where to go, or Chadley is telling you where to go. You go there, you do it, you check it off your list, and then you go to the next thing. And for some people that could feel kind of stale, kind of boring, and it does kind of take away that sense of spontaneity of going out on this adventure and just kind of discovering things for yourself. Now for me, that wasn't too much of an issue because I found that when I got to a new region, I didn't really look at the map right away. I just found myself running around exploring, and I came across towers and side quests and enemies on my own. So for me, my playthrough kind of still had that spontaneity to it, but I completely understand where people are coming from with that critique. And it looks like in Remake Part 3, they're going to be giving players way more freedom to explore. So I would expect less of a checklist kind of thing when it comes to navigation and using your map, and having things be actually missable. I think the developers have even mentioned that in previous interviews where they want the game to have secrets. You might get through the game on your first playthrough and then you watch someone else play and you're like, holy crap, there's a cave over there that had materia or a specific monster or item in it that I completely missed. And that's one of the beautiful things about Final Fantasy, especially the older Final Fantasies. You look at OG FF7, there were things on that map that were not marked. If you didn't explore with the Highwind, you would not know that there's a secret island that has the Knights of the Round materia. There's specific chocobo tracks, certain caves that you can go into, all unmarked on your map. And to bring back that element to Remake Part 3 and allow players to just kind of explore the environment on their own and either come across stuff or miss stuff is pretty genuinely exciting to me. And I think Chadley's whereabouts are going to kind of tie into that spontaneity, but we'll get to Chadley a little bit later because they do bring that up to the devs. Up next, they ask the devs what is the craziest fan theory that they have seen so far, and this one actually involves Chadley potentially being the final big bad of the entire Remake trilogy. Hamaguchi says, after the panel yesterday, we were chatting with the voice actors over dinner, and this exact topic came up, funnily enough. We were talking about Chadley, which is the character who supports Cloud in Rebirth, and we were talking about how, like, some people think he's actually evil and will turn out to be the last boss in the final title. We were cracking up about that, which I think is hilarious. I've covered a few theories here on the channel. I have not heard this insane theory of Chadley potentially being the final big bad that we're going to fight. But with that being said, I actually do like Chadley. I know some people got annoyed with him. They're not the craziest about Chadley, but I think that as a character, he's just so endearing. He's this cyborg kid who, you know, actually has some complex thoughts from time to time of like, well, I'm not from this planet. When I die, what's going to happen to me? Will I return to the planet? You know, he has this thirst for knowledge and wanting to learn everything he can about the planet and the life forms and all of these different specific areas. He's incredibly smart. He just has that curiosity that a young kid would have at that age. And, you know, we brought up earlier about the Rebirth kind of feeling maybe a little bit much like a checklist when you're exploring. And Chadley does have a lot to do with that because he's constantly guiding the player through a lot of these regions. But I think in Remake Part 3, and I brought this up before, so apologies for repeating myself, I think we might lose Chadley. Might not be permanently, but I think there's going to be a good chunk of that game where Chadley is just not available to us because of Hojo. So we won't have somebody to guide us around these maps, which in turn plays into the player being able to just kind of be spontaneous about their exploration and come across stuff on their own instead of Chadley telling us like, hey, there's a monster over there, or hey, there's a tower over there, or some sort of, you know, equipment you can find. And when it comes to Chadley's backstory, obviously we learn that he's this cyborg kid, but I think there's a lot more to him that people aren't really picking up on. And this is something that even I missed until I revisited the scene recently. But in the Nibelheim Proto-Relic missions, there's the scene where Chadley and Cloud are having a conversation and it cuts back to Hojo's lab. We see a body on one of Hojo's tables. We don't know who it is, but it's got a blanket over it and all we see is an arm. Hojo does some wizardry on his computer and messes with that body on the table, which in turn affects the AI cyber robot Chadley. He has this head pain that he can't pinpoint where it's coming from. So my theory is that maybe Chadley isn't just some sort of cyborg. Maybe at one point in time he was a real boy, a real kid that maybe Hojo found, experimented on, and now he's either dead or in some sort of weird coma while his brain is still actively being used to power cyborg Chadley and AI Chadley. So it's pretty dark, but Hojo is the type of character who would do that. He experiments on people, children, animals. That scene with Red 13 being captured for the first time is heartbreaking. So I think we're going to get a ton of info on Chadley in part 3, but no, I don't think he's going to be the big bad. But there could be a situation where maybe we do have to fight him because of Hojo creating some sort of, secondary Chadley monstrosity. Katase chimes in by talking about theories from fans about maybe the story changing too much. He responds by saying, "I don't know if this is something unexpected or anything, and I guess there's not really a specific thing or theory that I can comment on right now, but we do hear a lot of players' different conjecture saying, oh, how much will this story change from the original? And I want to comment that I don't think that's how it will be. We've always kept the original in mind, and I don't think it's going to be a storyline that will betray the fans of the original game. But also, at the same time, it's been 27 years since the release of the original FF7. There are these things that we feel we can only do now in the remake project that can bring a new happiness, a new sort of feeling of satisfaction to the players playing this game now 27 years later. What this will entail exactly is something we hope players will experience soon." And I've brought this up in many videos many moons ago before my channel kind of like blew up a tiny bit for, my standards. But one of the big fears a lot of fans had before Rebirth came out was, I think the story's going to change too much, and they weren't happy about that. But my thought was, I think that the main big plot points of the original FF7 will still be there. They'll still be intact. They'll still play out to, a degree that we remember them from in the original. But how we get to those moments is what's going to be different. So introducing characters like Chadley or Roche, having spins on those characters and how they affect the world. Those were never in the original, and those were brand new. So again, the big story stuff for the most part I think is going to stay the same, although I think you can make the argument that the ending might be slightly different if they're veering towards a story that prevents Advent children from actually playing out and allowing Cloud to have that closure and, check on his mental health to ensure that he's able to live without that guilt and that PTSD, and he can just be Cloud. And I very much enjoy a lot of the new stuff that they've thrown in there with Remake and Rebirth. It keeps things fresh, and as players who are familiar with the OG game, it keeps us on our toes, so we're not expecting the same thing to play out 27 years later. And it also makes it refreshing for the developers to be able to do new things and incorporate maybe ideas they had back then that they just couldn't pull off with the tech, but they can nowadays. Up next, they ask, is there a possibility that a real-life board game version of Queen's Blood could ever come to fruition? The developers laugh at this question, and the translator says, they've been asked this a lot. It's in high demand. Katase responds by saying, actually, when we had new hires come into Square Enix, to get people excited, they created their own DIY, real physical version of Queen's Blood on their own. There's only one in the world. Unfortunately, we cannot share this information of a physical retail version of the game with the rest of the world yet, but this in-studio version does exist, and it's not just the cards, but they made like a stage. They've shared a picture of this backdrop they made using 3D modeling. And they do provide a photo, and this is legit. This is an actual real-life Queen's Blood mock-up that the devs created. The cards are there. You can see a picture of Tifa. Pawn pieces are there, the chips, the actual castle. And seeing a real-life version of Queen's Blood would be really sick. I think maybe kind of creating it, though, for the masses might be a little difficult because there are aspects of Queen's Blood that just work really well in a digital environment that might be a little cumbersome in reality, like making sure that you're putting a card down in the right spot, putting those pawn pieces there, paying attention to which direction these cards are facing with their spacing. But Queen's Blood has been something that's so popular and so well received that I wouldn't put it past Square to actually manufacture this and sell it. And the fact that Katase is saying that we can't really share more information about it kind of hints to me that yeah, there's gonna be a Queen's Blood that eventually comes out and you can buy in retail stores. And I could see people having actual Queen's Blood tournaments at conventions to see who the best Queen's Blood player actually is. Up next, the devs are asked what were the hardest minigames to implement into Rebirth, and Hamaguchi responds by saying that seeing that Queen's Blood was this type of minigame, I knew that we had to put time and effort into creating something that would be satisfying to play in that way. While it was challenging to work on this, I think hearing the very positive feedback from the players, as you said, we succeeded in making this. He then goes on to say that as for the staff, they would most likely pick Chocobo Racing since you don't really need to know anything beforehand, you can just kind of jump in and race other people people, and I love both of these minigames. I think other than the piano, my two favorite minigames in Rebirth were Queen's Blood and the Chocobo Racing. Queen's Blood, once I wrapped my stupid head around it and finally understood the mechanics of how it worked, I was addicted. I couldn't wait to get new cards, I couldn't wait to get to a new city and find new victims to challenge in Queen's Blood and take their cards, but also learn more about these NPCs who are playing. And then there's the whole story within Queen's Blood of the Shadow Blood Queen and how it kind of mirrors stuff with Genova and the planet and Sephiroth that I thought was genuinely really intriguing, and it was mysterious, and I thought that it had a really cool payoff by the time you got to the end and you actually face the Shadow Blood Queen and Vincent's there and he gets to do cool stuff in that sequence as well. And then for the Chocobo Racing, it is so satisfying to do Chocobo Racing in that game. You can Tokyo drift around corners and get that speed boost, which feels great. Different Chocobos have different attributes and abilities, different speed boosts and whatnot. The courses are also really fun. They incorporated a lot of really fun, unique music into the races as well. And seeing a standalone for both of these would be super cool. Although we did have Chocobo GP, which didn't really do well, and that did get shut down. That was much more of a kart racer than a Chocobo racer. So I think if you were to take Chocobo Racing as it is in Rebirth, maybe release it as a free-to-play thing, I think it could do pretty well, and I think it would be a lot of fun, and it would be nice to be able to revisit it without having to go into Rebirth and then go to the Gold Saucer to do all that stuff. Up next, they ask Teruki Endo what was the most difficult battle mechanic or boss to pull off. He responds by saying, I love all the bosses, so it's hard to choose, but if I were to pick one, it would be the Galleon Beast. With Vincent, I think this was very unique in that it was a boss battle that required the players to almost switch or flow between action-based and then strategy-based battle. You would go in between these approaches and have to maneuver between them. I think this was very satisfying, and we were successfully able to implement this type of battle. Vincent's battle was awesome and it came out of nowhere. I was not full on expecting to fight Vincent, let alone in his Galleon Beast form, and once he transforms, he's a maniac. He's a straight up Bloodborne boss. His music even sounds like something out of Bloodborne, and I got my ass handed to me. Looking at the footage, my characters are just getting tossed around left and right, and I used the example of that episode of The Office where everyone's just kind of doing their own thing, and then the fire alarm goes off and everyone just starts panicking. That's how I felt fighting Vincent. But overall, I thought they did a fantastic job with it, and it's a really cool preview of what Vincent might potentially be in Remake Part 3. And then finally, to end the video, they talked to the developers about the very confusing ending and the mixed reception from fans. Hamaguchi goes on to say stuff that we have already covered before about how they knew from the beginning it would be a trilogy, and they wanted fans to be able to have something to latch onto in between Rebirth and Remake Part 3 releasing, and he's taken into account both positive and negative critiques of that ending, and that they're actually satisfied with that. Which, you know, again, I love the ending. The more I thought about it, the more I clicked with it, and the more excited it makes me for Remake Part 3. Katase goes on to expand by saying, also to add to this and offer an alternate perspective, when discussing the scenario with Tetsuya Nomura and Kazuhige Nojima, we were also talking about how in the original, it's showing Cloud's perspective. His feeling of immense loss of losing someone that you love and having this hole in your heart. When considering how to depict this in the remake series, we also thought about not only expressing this loss of someone who means so much to you, but also this sense of a person experiencing loss, being unable to force yourself to forget this person and almost like an inability to accept it, struggling with the possibility of losing someone. So that was something we wanted to show in Rebirth. Regardless, the original, its first disc ends with that huge loss, and I recall some people not even wanting to continue playing and changing over to disc 2 because they didn't want to play anymore because of that. It's such a huge feeling of loss and despair, but I do think there's a synchronization of feelings between the players and Cloud, struggling with how do I deal with this feeling, the feeling of loss, and how a person struggled to take that on was happening. We imagined the players of Rebirth would also have that synchronous feeling. And again, we talked about the ending of Rebirth and so many theories ad nauseum, but I again really love it, and to choose to display that ending from Cloud's perspective is a very ballsy choice, because you're going to have people that either start to click with it and understand it, or they do understand it, but they don't like it. They don't like it because of how it's portrayed, and it is very messy. It cuts around from so many different things, and it can leave a player feeling confused. And I've watched playthroughs of other people playing through Rebirth, and they've never played the original FF7. And when they get to the ending, they're like, wait, what's going on? What's happening? I thought I blocked Sephiroth's sword, but Aerith is still dead, and then there's this happening and that happening. But it is pretty cool to see a lot of the newbies. I like to shout out a content creator by the name of Kastaclysm, who played Rebirth and 7 Remake for the first time in her life last year. She had never touched a Final Fantasy prior to that. And it was really cool to see her play through Rebirth and kind of start to connect the dots towards the end and put 2 and 2 together on what's happening and how there might be these different worlds and how they're showing like different timelines, even though timelines isn't what is used anymore. By the end of her playthrough, she was actually starting to understand a lot of it and really starting to theorize about what was going on. And to see new players even latch onto that who didn't experience the original is pretty cool. But for those of us, who have lost people or we've lost animals, we've all been through that, experience of grief where you don't want to acknowledge at times that it happened. And for some people, when they experience those traumatic events, they completely block it out. And in Cloud's case, Aerith's not dead. I saved her. She's right here. Like I'm literally talking to her. She's going to go to the Forgotten Capital. She's going to pray and we're going to go find Sephiroth. It's going to be a-okay. And what's really cool is that in the credits go through everything that happened in that game with little videos that play. And when it gets to the section after Aerith dies, it's nothing but a blank space until we get to Rufus in the Shinra Tower talking to Sephiroth. And the fact that that memory wall there is missing just goes to show Cloud, the unreliable narrator, not wanting to accept what happened to Aerith. He's blocked out that entire scenario in his brain, and it's all going to come crashing down in Remake Part 3. But with that being said, this was a super long video, but the article itself I thought was really interesting. They touched on a lot of new things we haven't really talked about before, and they really went in depth with the ending of Rebirth, some of the gameplay mechanics, and Queen's Blood. So with that being said, if you made it to the end of this video, thank you. Make sure to click the like button, but let me know in the comments down below. What do you guys think about the topics that were covered in this article? Specifically, I would really love to know what you guys think about Remake Part 3 being more of a spontaneous adventure that feels less like checking things off of a list. I am Curious Corduroy. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.